Somewhere in Geneva, Switzerland, there is a windowless concrete building surrounded by barbed wire. From the outside, it looks like nothing, a logistics warehouse, the kind you drive past without a second glance. No sign tells you what's inside. No public tours are offered. Google Maps will show you the building, but it won't show you what's stacked floor to ceiling behind its blast-resistant doors. Inside that building, and a handful of others like it scattered across the planet, sits what may be the single greatest art collection ever assembled. More Picassos than most national museums, Warhols, Rothkos. A Da Vinci once floated through these halls, ancient Roman sarcophagi, gold bars, wine collections worth more than some small companies, and almost none of it has ever been seen by the public. This is the world of Freeports, and by some estimates, the art and valuables sitting inside them right now are worth more than $100 billion. Not sold, not displayed, not even, in many cases, taxed. Just sitting there quietly, sometimes for decades, while their owners get richer. Today we're going inside that world. We're going to talk about how Freeports actually work, the billionaires and criminals who have used them, the scandal that nearly brought the whole system down, and why almost nobody in government wants to touch this. Stick around, because the story gets stranger than you'd expect. There's a stolen Leonardo, a Malaysian fraud case, and a divorce battle that reads like a spy thriller. If stories like this, where money, secrecy, and power collide, are your thing, this channel covers exactly that every week. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss what's coming, because this particular rabbit hole gets deep. What is a Freeport actually? Let's start with the basic mechanics, because the concept is simple once you see it, but it's engineered to be confusing on purpose. A Freeport, sometimes called a free trade zone or bonded warehouse, is a special customs zone. Legally speaking, goods sitting inside a Freeport are treated as if they haven't actually entered the country yet. They're in a kind of legal limbo, physically present on Swiss, Luxembourgish, or Singaporean soil, but on paper, still in transit. That distinction sounds like a technicality. It isn't. It's the entire business model. Normally, when you import a painting, a car, a case of wine, or a gold bar into a country, you pay import duties and, in many places, value-added tax, VAT, which can run anywhere from 5% to over 20%, depending on the country. If you buy a $50 million painting at auction in New York and want to bring it home to France, you could be looking at a tax bill in the millions of dollars, sometimes more than $4 million on a single artwork. But if that painting instead goes into a Freeport, none of that tax is triggered. As far as customs is concerned, it never arrived. It's just parked. And because it's just parked, you can hold it there indefinitely, a year, a decade, 40 years, without ever paying a cent of import tax, sales tax, or VAT. Here's where it gets more interesting. You can also sell the painting while it sits there. Ownership can change hands, from one collector to a dealer to another collector, to an investment fund, multiple times, all without the artwork ever physically leaving the building. Because nothing crosses a border, no tax event is triggered on any of those transactions either. The painting could change owners 5 times in 5 years and generate zero tax revenue for any government, anywhere, the entire time. Freeports were not originally built for this. Historically, they were logistics hubs, places to store grain, coffee, tobacco, or industrial goods temporarily while they awaited re-export, so merchants weren't taxed twice on goods just passing through. The Geneva Freeport, the most famous of them all, actually traces its origins back to the 19th century, when it stored wine, coal, and food for the local population. It became a stop for goods moving through Switzerland's rail network. Even the Red Cross used its warehouses during World War II to stage humanitarian supplies. Then, starting in the mid-20th century, something shifted. In 1948, the Freeport took in its first shipment of gold bullion, and over the following decades, other precious merchandise steadily piled up alongside it. By the early 20th century, the facility was already handling cars and wine barrels with a railway connection to the national network, speeding the flow of goods in and out. What began as a practical warehouse for coal, food, and wine gradually became something else entirely: a warehouse for wealth itself. To picture the scale we're talking about, imagine roughly 20 American football fields of warehouse space stacked with vault rooms, each one climate-controlled to museum standards, holding more masterworks than the permanent collections of many national galleries combined, except none of it is ever hung on a wall for the public to see. That's the physical reality behind the $100 billion figure. Before we go further, if you're the kind of person who likes numbers and wants to actually picture how big $100 billion in art really is, drop a comment with your guess for how many square meters we're talking about. I'll tell you the real number in a minute, and I promise it's bigger than you think. Inside the Geneva Freeport. Let's talk specifics because the scale here is genuinely hard to process. The Geneva Freeport, officially the Ports Francs et Entrepôts de Genève, is widely considered the world's oldest and largest freeport facility, spanning roughly 150,000 square meters, with an estimated 40% of its contents being art. Various estimates place the total value of goods held there, most of it art, at around $100 billion. That figure has been repeated so often, it's become the defining statistic of the entire Freeport industry. And it reportedly originated from a former director of the smaller of Geneva's two Freeport sites, who described it as a conservative estimate. The facility is believed to hold roughly 1.2 million individual pieces across its buildings, and it isn't just paintings. Among the more striking reported contents, rare Etruscan sarcophagi that are believed to have sat untouched since the 1970s, wine collections, precious gems, classic cars, gold bars, basically anything portable, valuable, and worth protecting from taxation, theft, or prying eyes. The main headquarters building is a large windowless concrete block, ringed by barbed wire fencing, engineered to withstand earthquakes and fire, with most of its real footprint hidden in extensive basement levels below ground. Inside, individual storage rooms are climate-controlled for humidity and temperature, essentially built as impenetrable vaults, sealed behind unmarked blast-resistant doors, fitted with biometric access systems. It has been described, only half-jokingly, as looking like the set of a Bond film. And who exactly is storing their treasures here? We often only find out by accident, through leaks, lawsuits, or criminal investigations, because ownership at Freeports is, by design, extremely opaque. But a few names have surfaced. Russian billionaire Dmitry Rybolovlev reportedly built an art collection worth around $2 billion, including works by Mark Rothko, Vincent van Gogh, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Gustav Klimt's Water Serpents II, El Greco's Saint Sebastian, and Picasso's Les Noces de Pierrette, a collection widely reported to have passed through, and at least partly remained inside, the Geneva Freeport. We'll come back to Rybolovlev in a moment, because his story is the single wildest thing to ever come out of this world. Quick gut check, would you want to own a Picasso you can never actually hang on your wall? Let me know in the comments, because that's essentially the trade-off every Freeport collector is making. And it says a lot about what owning art even means when the point isn't to look at it. The man who built the modern Freeport empire, Yves Bouvier. If there's one person who turned the Freeport into the global art world phenomenon it is today, it's a Swiss businessman named Yves Bouvier. Bouvier ran Natural Le Coultre, a logistics and storage company that for years was the largest single tenant inside the Geneva Freeport. Through that company, and later through Freeports, he personally helped establish in Singapore and Luxembourg. Bouvier essentially became the architect of a global network, sometimes nicknamed the Freeport King, that let the ultra-wealthy move and store art with total discretion, minimal tax exposure, and maximum security. For years, Bouvier operated quietly as an art advisor and dealer to some of the richest collectors on the planet, including, for over a decade, Bouvier-Rybolovlev. Over roughly 9 years, Rybolovlev bought 38 major artworks through Bouvier, in deals reportedly worth around $2 billion total, including pieces by Pablo Picasso, Leonardo da Vinci, and Mark Rothko. Then in late 2014, Rybolovlev discovered something that changed everything. He claims he found out, by chance, that Bouvier had bought at least one of those paintings for tens of millions of dollars, less than what he'd charged Rybolovlev, while presenting himself the entire time as a neutral advisor working on Rybolovlev's behalf, not as an independent seller marking up the price. Rybolovlev's allegation that Bouvier had secretly acted as both buyer and seller, pocketing enormous markups while posing as a trusted advisor, defrauding him to the tune of roughly $1 billion across those 38 transactions. What followed was one of the most explosive legal sagas the art world has ever seen. In 2015, Bouvier was arrested in Monaco while en route to meet Rybolovlev, and the dispute exploded into criminal and civil proceedings across Monaco, Switzerland, Singapore, Hong Kong, and New York, with Rybolovlev accusing him of overcharging by roughly $1 billion. One of the paintings at the center of it all was almost unbelievably famous. Leonardo da Vinci's Salvator Mundi, which Rybolovlev bought through Bouvier, and which would later sell at a Christie's auction in 2017 for $450 million, the highest price ever paid for a painting at auction. The case dragged on for nearly a decade. In December 2019, Monaco's Court of Appeal dismissed the criminal proceedings against Bouvier, ruling that the investigation had been conducted with systematic partiality and bias. Bouvier declared a complete victory after Swiss prosecutors closed the criminal case in 2021, finding he had not committed criminal fraud, mismanagement, breach of trust, or money laundering. But that wasn't the end. Rybolovlev appealed, and remarkably, a Swiss criminal appeals court reinstated the investigation. It later emerged that part of what unraveled the original Monaco case against Bouvier was even stranger than the underlying fraud allegations. Charges against Bouvier in Monaco unraveled in 2019 after leaked offshore financial records revealed that Rybolovlev himself had allegedly been bribing Monegasque officials, including the country's justice minister, to help pursue the case against Bouvier. The European Court of Human Rights later ruled that Monaco's investigating judge had unlawfully accessed privileged communications between Rybolovlev and his own lawyer, a violation that effectively poisoned the original proceedings. After nearly 10 years, dozens of lawsuits across 6 jurisdictions, and reportedly hundreds of millions of dollars in legal fees on both sides, the two men finally reached a resolution. In early 2024, Bouvier-Rybolovlev settled their criminal dispute in Switzerland, agreeing they had no further claims against each other and would stop commenting publicly on their past disputes. A separate civil case Rybolovlev brought against Sotheby's, the auction house, for its alleged role in facilitating Bouvier's valuations, continued on afterward. There's a strange postscript, too. Even as the criminal saga wound down, Bouvier reportedly faced a separate tax bill of around $830 million from Swiss authorities, related to profits made on the Rybolovlev deals. Whatever the truth of who defrauded whom, one thing is undeniable. The entire affair pulled back the curtain on how Freeports actually function in practice, how a handful of trusted intermediaries can move billions of dollars in art through anonymous storage with valuations that outsiders have almost no way to verify. If you're finding this as wild as I did researching it, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who'd find this interesting. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time, because we're about to get into how Freeports have been used to hide stolen antiquities and even launder money from an actual international fraud scandal. Freeports and the looted antiquities. Scandal Bouvier's saga is about a dispute between two ultra-wealthy men. But Freeports have also played a role in something much darker: the global trade in looted and stolen archaeological artifacts. In one major case, Italian Carabinieri police raided a storage room inside the Geneva Freeport, rented by an art dealer named Giacomo Medici, operating through a company called Edition Services. Investigators found more than 3,800 ancient antiquities, worth an estimated $35 million, many still caked in dirt from excavation, along with documents linking the objects to art dealers and museums across Europe and North America. The objects had been illegally excavated in Italy and smuggled across the border into Switzerland. To disguise their true origin, Medici had attached fabricated provenance records to many of the pieces, often falsely attributing them to an anonymous Swiss private collection, claiming they had left Italy decades earlier, long enough to sidestep cultural property laws. This raid became one of the most important cases in the study of the illegal antiquities trade because it exposed something crucial. Freeports weren't just storing legitimate wealth. Their secrecy and lack of customs scrutiny made them an ideal staging ground for laundering looted cultural heritage. Objects stolen from archaeological sites, given fake paper trails, and then quietly reintroduced into the legitimate art market through prestigious dealers and eventually respected museums. It's worth pausing on why this matters beyond the money. Every looted antiquity represents a piece of archaeological and historical context that's been destroyed the moment it's ripped out of the ground by looters rather than excavated by archaeologists. Once an object loses its documented origin, we lose the ability to understand it fully: where it was found, what it was buried alongside, what it can tell us about the people who made it. Freeports, by design, made it easier to erase that history and replace it with a clean, untraceable story. The Medici case also mattered because of who was on the receiving end of the objects he moved through Geneva. This wasn't a black market operating purely in the shadows, sold only to anonymous private buyers. Investigators found that the trail from Medici's Freeport storage room led eventually towards some of the world's most respected auction houses, private dealers, and even major museums. Institutions that had, wittingly or not, acquired objects that began their journey as illegally excavated loot with a manufactured paper trail. It's a sobering reminder that the Freeport system doesn't just serve billionaires hiding investment assets. It can quietly launder an object's entire history, turning a looted artifact into a clean, exhibition-ready piece by the time it reaches a gallery wall or a museum vitrine. The 1MDB connection, J.H.O. Low and the Malaysian megafraud. Here's where the Freeport story connects to one of the largest financial fraud scandals of the 21st century. You may have heard of 1MDB, a Malaysian state investment fund that was supposed to fund development projects, but instead became the vehicle for what U.S. prosecutors have described as one of the largest kleptocracy cases in history, with billions of dollars allegedly siphoned off by a network connected to a Malaysian financier named Joe Low. Some of that stolen money reportedly flowed into fine art. By the end of a particular year, Low had reportedly acquired an art collection worth an estimated $330 million and stashed it inside the Geneva Freeport. He then allegedly worked to cover up how that art had actually been financed, including drafting letters, supposedly written by an associate, Eric Tan, offering him the artworks as a gift, an attempt to create a paper trail disguising the true, illicit source of the funds. This detail matters enormously because it shows exactly why Freeports have become such a magnet for law enforcement concern. It's not just wealthy collectors legally minimizing their tax bills. The same structural features that make Freeports attractive to legitimate collectors, anonymity, minimal custom scrutiny, and the ability to move ownership without ever physically moving the object, also make them remarkably attractive to people trying to hide stolen money. An object that's expensive, portable, and whose true value is often subjective and hard to verify is close to an ideal vehicle for laundering illicit funds, and a Freeport is close to an ideal place to park it while the paper trail gets muddied. If this is the kind of financial crime deep dive you're into, I've got other videos on this channel unpacking similar scandals. Go check the description or my channel page after this. And if you're new here, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. Why does this system even exist? The scale of the art market. To understand why Freeports have grown so large, you need to understand how the fine art market itself has changed over the past few decades. Art used to be, primarily, something people bought because they loved it, to hang on a wall, to look at, to live with. Increasingly, for a certain class of ultra-wealthy buyer, art has become something else entirely, an asset class, a store of value like gold or real estate, except one that's portable, easy to move across borders, historically resistant to inflation, and, crucially, much harder for regulators and tax authorities to value, track, or tax than a bank account or a stock portfolio. By one estimate, high-net-worth individuals allocated roughly $1.62 trillion to art and collectibles in 2016 alone, with some projections suggesting that figure could climb toward $2.7 trillion by 2026. That is an enormous and largely under-regulated pool of wealth, and Freeports have scaled right alongside it. By some counts, there are now roughly 3,500 Freeports around the world, though most of those are conventional logistics and trade Freeports, not the boutique security-obsessed art vaults we've been talking about. The art-focused Freeports are a smaller, more specialized subset, but they're the ones capturing headlines because of what and who they store. Beyond Geneva, other major hubs have emerged. Singapore's Freeport, which caters to wealthy Asian and international collectors in one of Asia's largest art markets, and Luxembourg's Freeport, opened by Bouvier himself, positioned as a tax-efficient storage hub serving the European Union. Even the United States has its own version, a Freeport located in Delaware, a state already famous for its favorable corporate and tax structures. Each of these facilities essentially offers the same core pitch: total security, total discretion, and a legal structure that lets valuable goods sit indefinitely without triggering the tax obligations that would normally apply the moment art enters a country or changes hands. The Geneva Freeport has been described, somewhat sardonically, as the world's largest art museum, one that happens to be completely inaccessible to the public. Think about the strangeness of that for a second. Somewhere in that building might be more masterpieces by iconic 20th century artists than most national galleries hold in their entire public collections, reportedly including something on the order of 1,000 Picasso works alone, alongside pieces attributed to Leonardo da Vinci, Klimt, Renoir, Warhol, and Van Gogh, and none of it is available for anyone outside a tiny circle of owners, advisors, and warehouse staff to ever actually see. Building the Empire, Luxembourg, Singapore, and what happened after Bouvier. It's worth spending a moment on exactly how Yves Bouvier built out this network, because the story of these buildings is almost as interesting as what's stored inside them. In 2005, Bouvier set his sights on Singapore, a jurisdiction that markets itself as the Switzerland of Asia, and getting the facility built required special legislation passed by the Singaporean Parliament. The Singapore Freeport finally opened in May 2010, built on government land, with direct access to the runways at Changi Airport, allowing valuables to move from aircraft to vault with minimal exposure. The building itself reportedly cost Bouvier around $100 million to construct, and one architecture writer memorably described it as an over-engineered hybrid of vault and temple. 4 years later, Bouvier repeated the formula in Europe. The Luxembourg Freeport opened in September 2014 in a ceremony attended by Luxembourg's Grand Duke himself, complete with a piece of music commissioned specifically for the occasion from the local Philharmonic. The opening generated real buzz in the art world. Auction house Christie's agreed to rent space inside the facility, and Luxembourg's central bank reportedly considered moving part of its gold reserves there from the Bank of England in London. The facility itself cost roughly 50 million euros to build and was designed by the same architecture firm, 3BM3, responsible for the Geneva and Singapore sites, with interiors by designer Johanna Grawunder. Bouvier described the concept behind these buildings clearly: not merely a place to store art, but a marketplace where art could change hands under what's technically called a suspensive VAT regime. That, in plain English, tax-free. Perfectly suited to art's growing role as a global investment vehicle, rather than simply something to look at. But as Bouvier's legal troubles with Rybolovlev escalated, his Freeport empire began to unravel with him. A member of the European Parliament's Special Committee on Financial Crimes, Tax Evasion, and Tax Avoidance publicly called for an investigation into the Luxembourg facility, describing it as potentially fertile ground for money laundering and tax evasion, a characterization the European Commission's former president, Jean-Claude Juncker, himself once Luxembourg's prime minister, pushed back against. By 2022, amid a broader anti-money laundering crackdown in Luxembourg, the Freeport reported a financial loss of 730,000 euros. Bouvier had exited, and new management had taken over. With the facility eventually rebranded away from his name entirely, now operating as the Luxembourg high-security hub. Singapore's facility went through its own transformation. Since 2022, majority ownership of what's now called Le Freeport has passed to Jihan Wu, a Chinese-born Singaporean cryptocurrency billionaire, through his holding company Bitdeer Technologies. A strikingly fitting evolution, given that cryptocurrency has become the 21st century's other favorite vehicle for moving large sums of value with minimal government visibility. An earlier attempted sale of the Singapore facility in 2020 collapsed into litigation, with Bouvier suing the prospective buyers after the deal fell through amid disputes over the building's condition. So in a strange way, the story of the Freeport network mirrors the story of its most famous asset class. Built up quietly over decades, exploding in value and attention, then becoming the subject of scandal, scrutiny, and ultimately new ownership, once the original architect's reputation became too costly to keep attached to the brand. The tax angle: how much money are governments actually losing? Let's get concrete about the money governments aren't collecting. A 2014 study, commissioned by the Canton of Geneva itself, attempted to quantify this, estimating that the Freeport's operations were costing the canton around 300 million Swiss francs a year in deferred tax revenue, underscoring just how much money in duties and taxes was effectively being put on indefinite hold. And that's just one canton, in one country, looking at one facility. Scale that logic up across every major free port, in Geneva, Luxembourg, Singapore, and Delaware, across decades of accumulated art and valuables, and you start to see why campaigners, journalists, and some lawmakers have grown increasingly uncomfortable with the arrangement. It isn't illegal. That's an important distinction we'll come back to. But it represents an enormous, legally sanctioned gap in the global tax system, one that's almost exclusively available to people wealthy enough to be buying and storing multi-million-dollar artworks in the first place. There's also a subtler cost beyond lost tax revenue: cultural loss. When masterworks by major artists disappear into Freeport storage for decades, they're removed from public view, from scholarship, from the kind of circulation that lets art actually do what it's meant to do: be seen, studied, and enjoyed. A Klimt sitting in climate-controlled darkness in a Geneva basement isn't teaching anyone anything. It's just appreciating in value, quietly, for its owner. This is exactly the kind of story where the comments section becomes half the fun. I want to know what you think. Is this smart, legal use of the tax code, or something that needs closing down? Drop your take below, and if you're enjoying the video, a like genuinely helps it reach more people who'd want to see this. The crackdown: how regulators are finally responding. For decades, Freeports operated with essentially no meaningful oversight specific to art and valuables. That has started to change, largely as a direct response to leaks and scandals, like the ones we've just covered. Leaked financial document caches, like the Paradise Papers in 2017, helped push European regulators to expand anti-money laundering rules to explicitly cover Freeports and art dealers, requiring customer due diligence on any transaction worth 10,000 euros or more. That pressure led directly to the EU's fifth anti-money laundering directive, agreed in April 2018 and taking effect on January 10, 2020. The directive extended anti-money laundering obligations to a wider range of sectors, including virtual currency exchanges, real estate agents, and, critically for our purposes, art dealers. Under the new rules, client screening became mandatory for art transactions worth 10,000 euros or more that pass through Freeports. An obligation covering not just the trade and brokering of art, but its storage as well. Transactions involving individuals or institutions from countries flagged as higher risk for money laundering or terrorist financing face even stricter screening requirements. A follow-up measure, the 6th Anti-Money Laundering Directive, went even further, making anti-money laundering screening and due diligence compulsory for essentially all participants in the art market, with harsher penalties for violations. Individual countries have layered their own rules on top. Belgium, for instance, enacted legislation in response to the 5th directive that specifically covers art galleries, dealers, auction houses, and Freeports, requiring registration of art market participants engaged in regular trading activity. Even the United States has taken notice. In July 2020, the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations published a report examining the art industry, effectively concluding that it was the largest legal, unregulated market in the country. That's a striking thing for a U.S. Senate body to conclude about any multi-billion-dollar industry, that the art trade had, up to that point, largely escaped the kind of scrutiny applied to banks, real estate, and other high-value sectors. Switzerland itself, feeling international pressure from bodies like the OECD and the Financial Action Task Force, began implementing its own regulatory reforms for Freeport specifically around 2015 and 2016, tightening some of the opacity that had made facilities like Geneva's so attractive in the first place. So the trend line is clear. The era of complete, unregulated secrecy is ending. But it's ending slowly, unevenly, and, critics would argue, well after tens of billions of dollars had already piled up behind those blast-resistant doors. Is this actually illegal? This is the question everyone eventually asks, and the honest answer is mostly no. Storing art in a Freeport is not by itself illegal. Deferring import duties and VAT by keeping goods in a customs-free zone is a legitimate, long-standing feature of international trade law. The same basic legal mechanism that lets a shipping container full of electronics sit in a port warehouse without triggering import tax until it actually clears customs into a country. Using that mechanism for art isn't fraud. It's simply applying an old legal tool to a new asset class. What crosses the line and what regulators, journalists, and prosecutors have increasingly focused on is what Freeport's secrecy can be used to conceal. Undisclosed beneficial ownership, laundered proceeds of crime, looted cultural property with fabricated provenance, or fraud between advisors and clients, as in the Bouvier-Rybolovlev case. The Freeport itself is neutral machinery. It's a warehouse with a favorable tax status. What makes it controversial is that the same features that make it useful for a legitimate collector protecting a valuable painting from theft, high security, low taxation, and discretion, are exactly the features that make it useful for someone trying to hide something they shouldn't have, or trying to defraud someone they're supposed to be advising. There's also a valuation problem baked into the whole system, and it deserves its own mention. Unlike a stock, which trades constantly and has an obvious publicly verifiable price, a painting's value is fundamentally a matter of opinion until the moment it actually sells. That single fact is what allowed the entire Bouvier-Rybolovlev dispute to exist in the first place. Two sides could look at the exact same transaction and genuinely disagree, in good faith or bad, about whether a price represented fair market value or a fraudulent markup. When that same asset then sits inside a Freeport, invisible to any public market, and often appraised only by parties with a financial interest in the outcome, the opportunity for that ambiguity to be exploited only grows. It's part of why regulators have shifted from asking, "Is this legal?" toward asking, "Can we even verify what's actually happening here?" A much harder question to answer when the underlying assets are sealed behind biometric doors in a jurisdiction that, until recently, had very little reason to ask. We're almost at the end here, and I want to leave you with the bigger picture. But first, if you've made it this far, you clearly like content that actually digs into how the world's money really moves. That's basically the whole premise of this channel. So, subscribing means you'll catch every future deep dive like this one. The bigger picture step back, and Freeports tell us something larger about how wealth works at the very top of the global economy. Most of us think about taxation and ownership in fairly straightforward terms. You buy something, you own it, you pay tax on it, maybe you sell it later and pay tax again. Freeports represent a parallel system that operates by different rules entirely, one where an asset can exist, appreciate, and change hands repeatedly, all while remaining functionally invisible to the tax authorities and often to the public. It's a system built for people wealthy enough to own $50 million paintings in the first place, serviced by a small, specialized industry of art advisors, logistics companies, and warehouse operators who understand exactly how to move value across borders without ever technically moving anything at all. And it raises a genuinely uncomfortable question. If $100 billion in wealth can sit quietly in a handful of warehouses, essentially untaxed, largely unseen by the public, and only occasionally glimpsed through scandal and litigation, what does that tell us about how much of the world's real wealth we simply never see at all? Freeports are, in that sense, a physical, almost tangible version of something we usually only talk about in the abstract: offshore wealth. When people discuss shell companies in the British Virgin Islands, or numbered accounts in old-school Swiss banking, or trusts registered in Delaware, it can all feel a bit conceptual. Numbers on a spreadsheet, entities that exist mostly on paper. A Freeport strips away that abstraction. It's a real building with a real address, filled with real physical objects you could reach out and touch, except you can't, because almost nobody outside a very small circle is ever allowed to. It makes the invisible architecture of global wealth suddenly uncomfortably concrete. The paintings in Geneva's Freeport are, in a real sense, hidden in plain sight. They exist. They're real physical objects. A Picasso is still a Picasso, whether it's hanging in the Museum of Modern Art or sealed behind a biometric vault door in a Swiss basement. But their function has changed entirely. They're not there to be looked at. They're there to hold value, quietly, for people who already have more of it than almost anyone else on Earth. So, next time you walk past a nondescript warehouse near an airport or a border crossing, remember, it might just be storing machine parts. Or it might be holding a fortune in masterpieces that will never hang on a wall, never enter a museum, and never be taxed, possibly for the rest of your lifetime. If you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe for more stories at the intersection of money, power, and secrecy. I put these out regularly, and you don't want to miss the next one. Drop a comment with what surprised you most today: the $100 billion figure, the Bouvier-Rybolovlev feud, or the 1MDB connection. I read everyone and often turn viewer questions into future videos. And if you know someone who'd find this as fascinating as you just did, send them this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.